The exhibition and, of course, Charles's lecture tonight tie in to the book that has been recently published by Charles Jencks on Corb and the Continual Revolution, but also, of course, to the specific areas of interest of the conference, which will be tomorrow, starting at 10:30. And I want to take this opportunity right at the beginning to ask all of you to please try and attend. I think it promises to be a very interesting conference with many of the most significant Corb scholars here trying to really address the relationship between Corb's different multiple practices and his work. Charles's book and in a sense the main focus of the lecture tonight is has a lot of parallels with the conference, but I think it also has some very particular and specific arguments that start with the publication of his book on Corb and the tragic view of architecture, but then the current book is a complete kind of brand new book, every word written from the beginning. And it is a demonstration of Charles's feeling, presumably, that there is a different story, or there is a need for a rethinking, rearticulation of the work that was done in the 70s. I think what is very specific about the focus of Charles's book is especially to do with the way that he is addressing the persona of Corb himself, and the speculations that he will obviously develop in terms of the personality of Corb himself, and the relationship between that personality and the development of his various projects, and the other kind of speculation that is going on, which is really situating the work of Corb within the context of more recent practices, recent developments, and see how he reappears, in a sense, in the context of various kinds of practices. But in any way, I won't go on. I would like you to join me in welcoming Charles Jencks. Thank you.
Thank you, Moisen. It's a pleasure to be here and take part in these proceedings today and tomorrow, and the exhibition, which was enjoyable to put together with this department here. I'm interested that you call him Corb. You know, in France, they don't like that. They call him Corbu, yeah. It's interesting how people take him over, appropriate him through the name. I'll mention a bit of that. I've got three basic ideas I want to put forward. One is the notion of continual revolution, or, if that's rather hackneyed, fast evolution. Secondly, the notion of his having a revolutionary personality, or what I've characterized in the book as a protean creativity. Proteus, the great god of creativity, reinvents himself many times. Thirdly, the importance of this for his mission, and the mission's importance for his protean reinvention. Something that I want to stress. Now, all of these ideas are partly based on a book that Howard Gardner wrote in 1993 about the revolutionary personality. It's called Creating Minds, and it deals with the 7 most creative personalities of the 20th century. That is Einstein, Stravinsky, T.S. Eliot, Picasso, Martha Graham, Gandhi, and Freud. You can argue with the 7. You can say, why not another 7? But those are fairly canonic. And in the appendix of the book, I show how Corbusier should be considered an 8th character in this list. Gardner is a cognitive scientist at Harvard, and since the word genius is politically incorrect, he carefully avoids it and refers to an exemplary creator, an EC. So if you don't like the word genius, and you don't think geniuses exist, then think of them as exemplary creators. I'm going to be speculating tonight on why and how it was that in the 20th century, an era of incredible turbulence and discord and change, Le Corbusier came to lead architecture in 5 different ways, or at least developed 5 different approaches and had 5 periods of contribution, some which overlapped. So like Duchamp or Picasso, he didn't follow a single track, but reinvented himself. The title of tomorrow is partly to do with reinvention, and reinvention relates to revolution. So I'm using, as a kind of textbook, Gardner's views, and yet I'm speculating that they may have another cause than the one that Gardner goes into, whereas he looks at the internal causes of continual reinvention. I'm going to speculate on external causes. So if I can have the slides, do I just press on? Yeah, right, okay. Well, evolution, or fast evolution or revolution. Of course, we all have mental ideas and mental sets on what evolution is, and since the 19th century Darwin, evolutionary trees, before Darwin of course, evolutionary trees were made, and we consider things now in an evolutionary context. So an iconography of evolution is important to think about, and I show you these really 19th century drawings, although they're 20th century too, and Bannister Fletcher's famous History of Architecture, which went through 20 or 30 editions, I can't remember how many, and I can't quite read it from here, but well, let me go up. He talks about the tree of architecture shows the main growth of evolution, the various styles, but must be taken as suggestive only, for minor influences cannot be indicated in the diagram of this kind. Well, good warning. But you see these women down here holding up the tree, and architecture is characteristically conventionally represented by a woman with her shirt sleeves rolled up, an older woman, the ionic order. And you can see all of the basic things of architecture down here, such as geology, I think geology there, climate, religion, society. The tree of architecture is a tree which in its main branch's trunk has the main line, of course, is Western, wouldn't you know? Greek, and then Roman, and then Renaissance, and you would have thought it would lead straight to St. Paul's Cathedral, but that's off here on its sub-branch. And amazingly, and obviously you can see where his marking is, it leads to New York City and Daniel Vernon's tallest building in the world, the 21-story building on 21st Street. The Flatiron Building, so which of course is in the Renaissance, isn't it, tradition and Roman tradition, and if you like, Greek tradition. So it happily, and since it's a skyscraper, it pulls it all together for his evolutionary tree, and it's progressive, and it's getting bigger and better all the time, as Haeckel, whose tree this stems from, Ernst Haeckel, the German philosopher of biology, and also did a tree of the evolutionary species. Well, we're warned in recent times by Stephen Jay Gould and others about recent iconographies for the evolution of animals. This is 1977. But we've been brought up on these trees, and they start in simplicity and they end in diversity and complexity and variety. And what in the book Wonderful Life, Stephen Jay Gould says, well, basically this is a false diagram. It's a false iconography. Evolution isn't, as Darwin hoped, progressive. It can go any which way. It has no plot. And in fact, it doesn't represent a tree like this, but a pruned bush where 99.99% of all species are dead. So all there are twigs, dead twigs in one species. Evolution is about decimation, and it doesn't go up. So those are the kind of iconographies and thoughts one should have when one looks at evolutionary trees. One should be skeptical as well as understanding of the metaphor of evolution. So in doing evolutionary trees, I have, first of all, put them sideways, shown in this one at least 6 major traditions, and the biggest tradition here, the unself-conscious tradition, is 80% of the environment, is where most building occurs and where most activity occurs. What part of my argument is going to be that Le Corbusier is a protean creator like Picasso because he appears more often in different kind of schools than any other architect. Not necessarily an indication of his worth or depth or quality, but an indication that he moved around. I do feel, however, that he moves around successfully, so I would qualify it by saying that this is also a qualitative diagram, and when he appears big, I think he's making a big contribution. Anyway, if you look at his 5 or 6 periods, and I don't put them down here, there was a National Romantic period or Art Nouveau period or period when he was working at home, I'll show you. Then there was the hero of the heroic period in the 20s, the white architecture, what people understand as modern architecture. Then, if that was the second contribution, there was his contribution to city planning, the plan Voisin, the contemporary city, 1923, 1925, and later city plans, which really did revolutionize the unself-conscious tradition and city planning doctrine and influenced city planning around the world. So 3 contributions. Then later, after the war, there is the Le Corbusier who reinvents himself and with the Unité d'Habitation and Chandigarh, and at the same time a movement starts within Team 10 of brutalism, based partly again on his definition of architecture and indeed his work at the Unité, so it's a brutalist kind of period. And at the same time, he was also producing Ronchamp and another kind of architecture, which is more in the intuitive and activist tradition, which is, as we know, something that leads to the Sydney Opera House, TWA, Bilbao, and elsewhere. And then there was just before he died, there was Le Centre Le Corbusier, not maybe of as much import as the it's here. Can you focus that? Not that you have to see it in focus, but leads to the high-tech movement. So that's 5 different approaches. And there's also, as I will be arguing, a possible 6th contribution. We'll see later. So, Continual Revolution. As these diagrams are meant to convey, it was a turbulent period, and he jumped around from one tradition to another. Why and how? That's the first question. Well, thank you, Madelon, who's in the audience, who painted this picture. We dispute whether it's St. Jerome or not, but she says it's not, and since she painted it, she must be right. Anyway, my comparison is, of course, with Corbusier's 4 books, the 4 books of Revolution, written in the 20s, as articles in L'Esprit Nouveau, written and presented here, interestingly, in an advertisement towards a new architecture in 1923, urbanism, 1924 and 25, and 25. It came out with 3 books in 1925, A Peinture Moderne with Aux Enfants and Art Décoratif Aujourd'hui. It's interesting in this advertisement that he's presenting them books as tombstones or as tablets, the holy tablets, the Bible. And his mission was clear as a prophetic mission. In other words, the spiritual, religious voice in his writing is clear in these tomes. And it's a metaphor which is a spirituality which is not apparent until really to himself late in his career. But the importance of the book is one of the reasons, I think, that he does reinvent himself. The book, painting, and women are 3 catalysts I'm going to be arguing, and upstairs and tomorrow we'll be showing aspects of the book. Why that should be the case would take a lot more time than I have tonight. I mean, why the book should be so important. Tomorrow I'm going to be discussing the revenge of the book, and we'll get into this a little bit. But I want to just show very briefly these 5 different periods. And on the left, you see the young Charles Jeanneret hiking through the mountains of La Chaux-de-Fonds. Maybe it looks like it's been set up in a studio, actually. I don't know. And Stan von Most published it, and he's here. I don't know if this is a real photograph or did he put twigs behind him and appear as the mountain climber. But it certainly looks posed, doesn't it? Like Ruskin in Nature, and Ruskin was his man. At this time of his life, he wanted to be set in a landscape, natural landscape. You see on the right 5 villas and the villa of his leader, Charles Le Platinier, here in the mountaintop on the outskirts of La Chaux-de-Fonds, one of the hills. And it's interesting that he built most of these villas. I think it's interesting because he, in forming his character at the age of 17 and a half when he started work on these villas, he had a view of an ideal city that stems partly from of having a villa in pristine nature, surrounded by a mountainscape and no pollution and no one too close by. So, in a sense, all of these villas are temples set in nature. And one of my arguments is that his city planning stems from the misapprehension that it could be the same hillside that he was designing at the age of 17 and a half. He tried to turn the city into this kind of hillside. He was studying not only Ruskin and learning from Le Platinier, his teacher, but reading Owen Jones and the Grammar of Ornament, it's an absolutely key text for his later thinking, and speculating with ornament, as Jones had said to do, as a symphonic order, a symphonic mathematical order that revealed deeper laws of nature. So you can see in this painting a kind of let's say, a tiling pattern or wallpaper design or something for a watch he might be engraving. You can see the diagonal grid, and in this analysis I've done, you can see different grids, both diagonal and rectilinear, and the way they give a kind of syncopation of these tree motifs, fir motifs. And they are further stylized in abstract representations of the snow, of the pine tree and the pine cone, again on diagonal grids as well as rectilinear ones. So, like Art Nouveau artists at the time trying to have a new grammar of ornament, new grammar of design based on the facts of nature, in this case the surrounding trees. And this first work produced at 17 and a half with his fellow classmates and an architect, more or less carries forward the Ruskinian ideal of a new national and romantic language based on nature. So you see here the beginning of an evolution which I think continues throughout his life, an interest in nature and the cosmos as giving a symbolism, a symbol system. In this case, one that you can read up the facade, the mountains or the pine trees or the pyramids, which essentialize both, which abstract both of them, the trees and the branches here in the double glazing, leading to his later double glazing and his idea of air conditioning. And above that, cloud forms, and above that, these leaf forms in incredible sgraffito stucco, which today is as colorful as it was something like, let's see, about 93 years ago. Amazingly, more than any other building of his, it stood the test of time. So incredibly well built, along the idea of the arts and crafts movement. That is a layering of it to show the inherent metaphor abstracted out. It sits on, as it were, the geological base, which is what Ruskin says should be behind all architecture. So in one of his drawings, which I've abstracted out here, You can see the motif of geology leading to a crow step motif, and then a layer of stones, and then soil roots and tubers in this layer, and then flowers in this layer. So this drawing of his is a cross-section through the earth, and a later fellow, Villa-Jacquemet, more or less does that with masonry, shrubs at this level, people at this level, represented at this level, and above that birds and trees, and then sky and clouds with little Gaudian caps on the chimney there. So the building, in a sense, is a layered metaphor of cosmic or natural symbolism. Throughout his life, there are many returns to this notion that there must be something in the universe which will lead to a universal symbolism, if only we could get the key. Well, those developments and readings, he says later on when he develops the modular, he traces the modular back to this sketch of the bud, something that Alan Brooks is skeptical about. But anyway, he says this was the origin of mathematics. And so he zooms in on the bud, and then you can see pine cones and pineapples. He sketches, and again, I've drawn in the spirals and shown later analyses to show that, you know, what was in the air in 1900, the underlying geometries of nature being based on some, in this case, Fibonacci series, that is, this number series of 1, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, and so forth, up to infinity, generate sunflower, for instance, generates these two different Fibonacci series, and they interlock. And this idea, of course, was within the classical tradition. So you can find the chapel at Annay that Philippe Bert-Delorme designed. You can see the spirals in that, and you can see the solar symbolism in that, just as the Pantheon had with the stars in here. Connecting the cosmos above to the earth below. And so that layering and symbolism then are canonic to the classical tradition. It's just the level at which the young Charles Jeanneret takes it is obsessive and completely, something that stays with him throughout his life. It isn't really until quite recently, though, with the emergent science of fractals and complexity theory and analysis by the French scientists that we understand why the pineapple, for instance, like a pine cone, and 80% of growing species do have this Fibonacci number series. And while for the young Charles Jeanneret it was a very mystical thing and something that led him directly into the idea of initiation in the Pythagorean brotherhood and a deeply religious view. Today, in the 90s, the French, among others, scientists have understood why it is and how extraordinary it is that the geometry and the mathematics produce these series which lead to the most efficient form of close packing. And how do they do it? How do they know to do it over time? How do they know to grow that way? Well, Darwinism can't explain this. It seems that there's something deeper than Darwinism. In other words, the survival of the fittest pineapple may depend in some important way on close packing, but the geometries of that are deeper than the natural selection. This ammonite shows, again, the kind of spiral form in a different context. It's not the Fibonacci spiral, but it's the self-similar one, in which all these chambers are self-similar to the next one. So you can rotate it around, and this animal knows how to grow in just the right way and just continue to grow that way. So those sort of things have developed more recently with a different kind of emphasis than the one Le Corbusier gave them as a young man and throughout his life. But I want to emphasize this notion of mathematics and geometry and mysticism as a kind of underpinning for the development of his mind and character, because it seems to me part of his mission that empowers him and leads to notions of city planning. Without the mission, one can't understand why he was so obsessive and so creative. And he begins to convince himself that geometry should underlie all buildings. So even this classical building, the La Scala Cinema in La Chaux-de-Fonds, 1916, which he, by the way, steals from another architect, steals a job, and designs this extraordinary classical harmonic facade with a square and the double square and 45-degree and 22.5-degree and all of the subdivisions of the Pythagorean numbers. Even designed in a kind of postmodern false facade, because if you go behind this part of the building, you see that the cinemas only fills up this amount of space. So all of this is a false front, just meant to complete this Pythagorean geometry. You can see in that early classical work, or the late Unité, 1947-52, you see the regulating lines, the kind of lines that he would draw on his buildings after he designed them, by the way, to tune them to the cosmos, to make sure that they reached the kind of visual harmony and perfection he was after. So this mission, however, was not a straightforward mission. It was a zigzag mission, and it's interesting that Alan Brooks has unearthed this early work, this early book written in 1910, but not ever finished or published, called La Construction des Villes, in which you see a diagram here, here, and here. And in it is the mistake, one of the diagrams is called the mistake of the grid, in which he argues in 1910 that you should never design in grids. You should never design in straight lines either. You should have curved lines, and you should follow the lessons of Camillo Sitte and that kind of city planning. The reason is, among other things, that if you design a gridded city to go from A to B, he shows that you go zigzag through, and you take twice as long as you would if you went in a nice curve, like that curve, or like that. In other words, a gentle curve is the proper way to do it, and he redesigns La Chaux-de-Fonds as a garden city in those proper curves. And it's interesting, he fulminates in this unpublished work against the gridded city and the straight line, and he says you must follow the pack donkey's way, the ass's way, because a pack donkey zigzags or curves and zigzags up a hill. And it's interesting that 10 years later, in 1920, he starts reversing these propositions. Then it comes out with the book Urbanism, where he turns everything on its head and says you must never follow the pack donkey's way, the ass's way. Man has an end in view and walks in a straight line. Cities should all be in grids, and city built for speed is built for success. And so he more or less takes all of the examples, and even some of the same metaphors, and he turns them upside down. So you see this incredible dialectical ability to turn his own thinking around, to reverse his field. Again, why is this the case, and how is this the case? Well, I'll come back to that a little bit later, but let me say that if you look at his city planning, I'm not going to be discussing the city planning beyond a few remarks now, nor am I going to discuss all of the motives that this led to, the white architecture, the idea of that the domino block led to the diagram of modern architecture, which has been endlessly analyzed by Colin Rowe, Kenneth Frampton, and other historians. I show it here in an unusual form, which is how he conceived of it, as two domino blocks connected with the with the staircases on the outside, and extruded to a kind of infinity, generating a city block. These are both about 1916, both the diagram and the city block. a time when, during the First World War, a lot of houses had been destroyed, and he could see that the answer to it would be a kind of new mass-produced reinforced concrete. So he wanted to work out a new technique. He wanted to patent the domino block. He wanted to become a businessman and a constructor. So he produced this diagram and then produced this diagram of the city. And again, I've operated on it slightly by doubling it and showing how it generates a superblock. And it has the element of streets in the air, an elevated pedestrian deck on which you live, and then passerelles at the top at street level, and then circulation underground or on the ground level. So you find then his later city planning ideas, his revolutions in city planning, already at this early, coming out of this early diagram, a diagram which is the ultimate gridded diagram of the modern city. In other words, from the domino block, cities in straight lines and grids are generated. And you can see that in some of his later work, the Plan Voisin here of 1925, contrasted at the same scale of New York City, which he found an absolute mess, as he explains in these contrasts between the old city and the system advocated. Here, his cruciform skyscrapers. And here's what he doesn't like at all. He spent most of his life trying to get over the tentacular city, the city of tentacles. He compared it to a kind of, I don't know, a hydra-headed octopus. And he thought it led to all of our problems. So instead of having that kind of organization or this kind of organization, he had this kind, which is a circular city where all the streets run around each other, but since that wouldn't quite work, he transformed it into straight lines, because by 1923, as I said, 1924, he says, get rid of the pack donkey's way, get rid of all curves, and bring in the grid. So what you find then is that the city is really, the idea of the city is based on a traffic circulation diagram. Making it safe for cars is the primary thing. In order to bring nature into the city, to make it like the hillside in La Chaux-de-Fonds. And he rejects this kind of coagulation because, I would argue, he hasn't a theory of why the fractal city seen from the air is actually a very benign element. In other words, if he could look back, as I imagine he would today, in hindsight at these diagrams, he would invert the two of them and reverse fields once again. But Fractal City had only been written in 1994, and so he couldn't see the beauty of the upper diagram of New York City. He was looking for a Platonic kind of beauty, and you see, as traffic circulation goes, the center of the city ends in a mass pedestrian open square, a huge open square. He cuts down 2 miles of square of downtown Paris. He obliterates it for these skyscrapers. And he says he makes it 80% green. But I think if you look more closely at the amount of traffic circulation, you count up the roads, it's really more like 50% green. Anyway, I analyzed the things he saved. And it's interesting, he saved 24 major monuments. And when he writes about this, he says, look, with the Plan Voisin, you can actually have the past, and you have the past in a green field, as it were, so, among the trees and among the robins and the pigeons and so on. And it's really kind of a beautiful, idyllic past. But if you look at these monuments, you see it's a past in which the great monuments are hidden among his incredible skyscrapers, his city of affairs, his city of businessmen. And it leads me to see this as the archetypal diagram of modern city planning. In other words, it's Christ's advice to Mary Magdalene, Nola me tangere, do not touch me. It's an urbanism in which the past is cleaned, the marbles are polished, and they're left in a perfect nature, and around it, circulation and the 20th century, the 21st century, go on. Rather the way Norman Foster has treated the Royal Academy. In other words, he's polished it, cleaned it up, and then contrasted with it without relating to it. In other words, it's a kind of beautiful contrast of a perfected 20th century technology set against a past no longer valid technology. Well, it's that kind of attitude which is later reversed itself, as we'll see with Chandigarh. In other words, that nolum tangere, the don't touch me, don't interact, is also inverted. And I am arguing that it is the influence of these three things: painting, women, and books, which jolt him out of his dogmatic, not slumber, but his dogmatic activity, his dogmatic preaching. The thing about him, if you read his works, is that he, especially his writings on city planning, he's incredibly intolerant of other people's opinions, or people who disagree with him. At the same time, out of the corner of his ear, he writes everything down, that all these attacks on his ideas, and waits for a later moment where he, in a sense, answers, if only obliquely, some of their criticism. And I think he gets himself out of his dogmatic ruts through the influence of women and his constant interaction with women. And you see there one of his early Fauvist paintings in a Parisian brothel, which he may have gone to several times. He used to run off to Paris, get out of the small Swiss town of La Chaux-de-Fonds, and go off to Paris to sell interior furnishings and have a good time. And like, he may have considered himself like this absinthe drinker in the back here, sort of sad old man drinking, because he considered himself a terrible ugly duckling. And he may have gone into these brothels as much like Rodin, the traditional French painter, did, to paint as to do other things, because you didn't have to pay for models in a brothel, and they were more, of course, interesting than the hired model. In any case, there are these incredibly strong Fauvist paintings in which the colors of everything are inverted. Before the later paintings of 1918 and 19, this is almost his first painting, and done under the influence of Ozonfon. And you can see, as in Purist Doctrine, you can see the pipe type, and elongated, almost like an opium pipe. You can see the scroll, and then a wonderful cube, and then this extraordinary Mannerist glass teetering on the edge of fracture. And he compares these tablescapes, interestingly, to the Parthenon. So in his mind, there's a metaphor between this abstraction here and the incredible passionate encounter he had with the Acropolis. Well, by the 20s, then, coming out of this change of Ozonfon and women was this new invention of Le Corbusier, the person, invented, as he describes very amusingly, by accident, a complete accident, changed his personality because he had to write articles on architecture, and Ozonfon demanded that he take this name, Le Corbusier, and then the name swallowed his real name, and no one believed that his real name was his name. When he, for instance, traveled and went over the border, people would look at his passport and they'd say, now, who are you? And he'd say, well, Charles Jeanneret. And they'd say, well, you're not allowed in this country. And he'd say, well, but Le Corbusier. And they'd say, well, fine, where's the letter? And he'd show the letter. It was written to Le Corbusier. And so many encounters like this forced him to change his name, Charles Jeanneret, to Le Corbusier, because Le Corbusier became incredibly famous around the world. It became this persona by accident, really. And he learned to love the persona and to think of it as not really himself, as a kind of third person. Anyway, by the late 20s, it was creating the new white architecture. And I just want to, since it has been so well analyzed and thought to death, I just want to point out some obvious things about its relation to nature. Here it is above nature. As he says, you shouldn't live on nature. It takes a very strange attitude now. Under the influence of Dr. Pierre Winter, he says, it is shown that people who live on nature tend to get microbes. They tend to get, worms. They tend to get things that are tuberculosis. They tend to get all of these very nasty things. So it's much better to live above nature in a kind of white hospital. And so you can see this as the ultimate counter to nature, which is how some people see it. But at the same time, and this is how I want to stress it, as an abstract representation of a walk through nature. In other words, the whiteness, the sun, and above all, the ramp that takes you through a purifying ritual where you come out, you wash your hands here in the object-type basin, you take off your black hat and leave it here. There's an object type for every action on your way upstairs in this rite of passage towards the rooftop, which ends in Madame Savoie's roofscape, where she was supposed to bathe in the nude and see the three essential joys of the universe, sun, space, and greenery, through that picture window. In fact, they were, at that time, very present through that picture window. In other words, this building, in its own way, is another metaphor for the celebration of nature and the cosmos, and his definition of architecture as the magnificent play of volume seen in sunlight. And very close, I think, to the kind of writing he was doing in 1925 in Art Décoratif Aujourd'hui, in this chapter on the spirit of truth, where he shows a cross-section through a plant, a dirigible, and a cosmic event, such as a misunderstanding maybe of the orbits of planets, more elliptical and circular, but then interesting, possible, dangerous asteroids coming through, leaving fantastic trails. All of that, esprit de vérité, the spirit of truth, being connecting up once again to a cosmic idea of architecture, celebrating our relation to the universe. These photographs were, of course, ripped off from many different sources, and I think presented in a persuasive way that Ozefont had explained to him. So in a sense, what he did to the book at this time, and why these books are still in print and reprinted countless times, is that he reinvents the book as part magazine, part diagram, part teaching diagram, and part amazing juxtaposition of genres. And it is all of those things which lead to their continuous selling and relevance. Now, another period of his work develops after the war is a transformation of these themes. Chandigarh, and I show these two shots to bring out something that isn't the normal point made about Chandigarh, and that is the way in which it is a kind of garden city celebrating nature. Of course, the waterways and the greenways which run through the city, and most of all, the diversion of a river and turning it into a lake, and the construction of a sewer system and a waterway system, which has made Chandigarh one of the nicest cities in India, the city that many people migrate to because of these waterways and sewers. If you know India, you know that one of the most horrible things about it is that people really literally live next to sewers, and they're open, and water purification is not done enough, so that water and greenery are things that are sought after, especially in the semi-arid climate. So there is a way in which I think it's fair to say there was a green ecological Corbusier in maybe even in the 30s, as some people are now arguing, but starting to get out by 1950 in Chandigarh. Nevertheless, I'd like to criticize it partly for really getting some of this cosmic symbolism completely wrong, especially in the capital, open, which is a huge area of open space in what is often 140-degree summer heat for maybe 2 or 3 months of the summer, an impossible baking, terrifying heat. In many ways, of course, the architecture celebrates the sun and heat. In fact, and there are monsoons, and it celebrates them, those two, as we'll see. But in terms of function, this Acropolis landscape is really horrifically open and not pulled together. So ways in which his symbolism and his functional planning are extremely retrograde. The way his dogmatism overwhelms his change. On the right there, a photograph of Charles Correa at the recent celebration of Chandigarh and the 50 years of Chandigarh in front of the open hand, the hand that pivots in the wind. In the, there it is in the model there, the ditch of consideration. It's a place where people were, where the citizens were meant to meet and discuss politics. But in fact, it's outside the city, as this whole public realm is, distanced from the people, and therefore not really a political realm. Part of the problems, of course, have to do with the fact that Chandigarh has been split up into 2 different states. So one of the political failings is not his fault. But the major problems, both urbanistically, social, and politically, are, I think, brought out by this monument to the open hand. On the right, you see it as Corbusier idealized it, as a multivalent symbol, a bird, as well as a hand with 3 fingers sticking up, rather the way meant to relate in its outline to the Himalayas. Something that spins in the wind, signifying maybe political vacillation and change. You can see the place for the citizens to come and debate. Well, a teacher in this school, Rodrigo de Perez de Arce, has produced a re-urbanization of Chandigarh, which I think is very much to the point, and it argues in effect that if you're going to have public monuments, the public realm, they need to be surrounded by tissue, the background tissue, and the private realm. And if you're going to service it, the public realm that is, in debates, it has to have cafes and covered spaces that people can drink and have a good life. So he redesigned Chandigarh, and especially the heated Acropolis, with these very interesting buildings. Needless to say that politicians and planners of Chandigarh are not about to build this. At the same time, however, Le Corbusier has developed beyond this noli me tangere attitude, and he embraces traditional and historic Muslim and Hindu architecture in all sorts of understated and oblique ways. For instance, the notion that you find in places like Jaipur or Fatehpur Sikri, where these covered passageways shield you from the sun, and causeways go across, thin ones in this case, go across reflecting pools. You can see in Chandigarh, in the capital here, how a series of axes are approached and focused on elements and then shifted left or right, so that the L shift is a constant handling of the space. And as he imagined it, there would be passerelles, there are some of them, which would unify these monuments. You also see these the reflecting pools there, and the fact that the key building, the assembly building, is oriented absolute north, so that people are subject to a natural or cosmic orientation. Now, these buildings can be read and have been read I think correctly, in many different ways, and that's part of their depth and greatness. This is the entryway to the assembly building, made out of concrete, of course, as so much is here, and it has this gigantic, probably the biggest gutter in the world for the monsoon rains, and entryway, of course, to announce the entryway, kind of new version of a classical order, with this tilted prow shape here. And it has been compared to the horns of the cows in the area, I think, again, correctly, I think, and the upraised hands of both Corbusier himself and, in this case, on the right, a drawing of Josephine Baker, I imagine, singing, as she often did in the nude. Josephine Baker, if you don't know, was one of the great and attractive women who came over from St. Louis and settled in Paris and attracted Adolf Loos, who designed Haustor, and she was really the, as Marx would say, the opiate of the intellectuals. And Corbusier, among many others, fell in love with her. She was a black singer who could really dance extraordinarily well, and she did dance in the nude and sing in the nude. And through the 20s and into the 30s, and then in the 50s, she established a retreat for infants and for orphans. So she had a kind of interest both in the world of singing and music, and the world of utopian life. And you can see why then Le Corbusier would have fallen in love with her in the late 20s and early 30s. In any case, if you look at the building as a symbol system, it seems to me it's one of the most successful examples of symbolic architecture in the 20th century, and something that is an implicit critique of Venturian architecture, signs stuck on buildings. Because whereas Venturi writes about symbolism in Learning from Las Vegas, he fundamentally confuses it with signs. And here, and I think this building makes the argument, a symbol is something that's multivalent, ambiguous, is something that mediates between the everyday and nature, daily life and the banal and the heroic, is something that relates to function, light, ornament, space, is not something that you can figure out. A sign is something you stick on. A sign is like a stop sign or a high flyer at Las Vegas. A sign is denotative, where a symbol is connotative and endlessly suggestive. So this building, I would say, is one of the most successful examples of a cosmic architecture that celebrates the relationship to the fundamental facts of Chandigarh, which are the incredible heat of the summer sun and the monsoon rains and such things as the birds that actually fly. This is a rendition of one of the birds that sits on the top of these buildings and makes a lot of noise, as well as other things in Hindu architecture, the cow, the sacred cow, and a whole lot of personal signs here, and the tree, the pine cone, and so forth. Over the whole thing is this, what he called the authority. At first, in the 30s, he dedicated his books to authority in a kind of fascist way, but later he thought that the sun was the authority, and you can see the summer sun here and the winter sun there. And what's interesting about this, what makes it a symbolic building, is you go through it, you see the enameled door, and then you come into the antithesis of the sun and the brilliance, and you come into this very dark, cool space, which is the forum space before you go into the General Assembly. You can see it's surrounded by sunshades on the outside. You can see the sun and the air passing through those points, and this very high space with the sun, with the heat rising to the top. It's painted black. So it's a transformation then of these signs into symbols. On the roofscape, he even imagines that there'll be an outdoor amphitheater for meetings, and you can see in this cooling tower form a series of signs and symbols which were obviously taken over from this 18th century garden of cosmic instruments. There's some in Jaipur and some in New Delhi, and they're very, of course, sculptural elements. Well, I think that it is a convincing building, and the conviction of the symbolism goes right into the inside, where he imagined that there would be festivals once a year, and some of these things would, this one is of course, the winter sun and the summer sun. These would roll apart, and a ray of light would shine down on the rostrum of the speaker, as everybody oriented absolute north would partake in some kind of solar festival. As he said, man, son of the sun, would be reminded of this once a year. Well, again, the idea is, in a sense, canonic to the Western architecture, as you can see from this great oculus at the Pantheon. Another Corbusier, of course, emerges in the 20s, the lightweight constructivist Corbusier, the one who's interested in mass culture and signs stuck on buildings, but composed in interesting ways. The Nestle Fair building on the right, or the Palace of the Soviets on the left. That amazing tensile structure with its early version of the St. Louis Arch, or the horrible M of McDonald's hamburgers, which are sons of this building. His lightweight aesthetic, and it's interesting what would have happened if he hadn't had the definition of architecture, the masterly correct and magnificent play of volume seen in sunlight, or the Parthenon, if he wasn't so obsessed by the Parthenon. Because in this chapter of Towards a New Architecture, he compares the Parthenon to these very solid, heavyweight sculptural automobiles. And if he had opened the bonnet and looked at the engine inside, there might have been a whole different lightweight tradition that developed. This is the 1937 Pavilion. And this develops at the end of his life. Finally, one of his last buildings, Le Centre Le Corbusier, which is screwed together with, or bolted together with 20,000 bolts, this amazing semaphoric building under another umbrella, like the previous building I just showed you, the same sort of section, and something that obviously has affinities in color coding and handling of services. Well, it doesn't so much feature them as the Pompidou Center, but certainly in its bolted together, Jean Prouvé kind of aesthetic, you can see there was this other Le Corbusier beginning to get out at the end of his life. In other words, one that, in a sense, inverted those definitions of architecture. And I would make the argument that even there is the blob biomorphic architecture evident in this building of 1958 for the Brussels World Fair. The stomach building, he keeps calling it a stomach that engorges people and then evacuates them at the end after taking part in a light and sound show. I mean, this is amazing. Before McLuhan, 8 years before Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, is seeing the importance of the second electronic revolution, the second machine age, as he calls it, designing hyperbolic paraboloid buildings with Xenakis, and designing a light and sound show. I mean, amazing, too, to think that he was involved in this new media as the future of media. He designed something like a 6 or 7 minute show in which projected on the surfaces of the stomach, this curvilinear blobby stomach, were images, cosmic images again, or natural images of a drama, the drama of life. So I make the argument that there would be a continuous revolution and reinvention in his work had he survived and gone on and been alive today. And I think one of the reasons that helped him, drove him, was his connection to women. He was very devoted to his mother, you see here, who lived to the age of 102. And she was the one woman that he feared. There are accounts that he was really frightened of her. I don't know how much credence one should give to them. But he speaks about her continuously and writes about her, as well as his aunt and his wife, who you see here, is very devoted to his wife. That is, when he was in Paris, he was very devoted to his wife. You see him here. You see her here in one of his œuvres complètes. Above the caption, the kitchen has become one of the most essential rooms of the house. It depends on how you want to read that, as anti-feminine or liberated. There is a feminist, Le Corbusier, apparently, I've been reading, about to be launched on us, but putting the woman in the kitchen is not part of it. On the other hand, opening it up to light and making it connected to the rest of the building is, and by 1947, he sees that as important. This is 1930, where it's not so important. It's interesting, Yvonne, his wife, one of the few remarks that come down to us of hers on architecture was that all this light is killing me, is driving me crazy. So you can see that it's interesting that should survive, because he liked her for her earthy humor and her contradiction. At least to a point. If you trace his relation to women right back, and I don't know how far one can do this in the book. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. There's these very strange paintings that he made when he was back in La Chaux-de-Fonds in 1913, when he was, let's see, must have been about 26 or 27. He was remembering his great moments on Mount Athos, and of drinking and getting drunk and sensuality. And so he's having these memories, and he would paint at night, paint by memory. And this one is called Vin d'Athos, Wine of Athos. And you see this sort of Dionysian woman whose back she's leaning back, and she's on the back of a ass whose back is broken. And her and the diagonals here, the colors are very strong, and again, Fauves, the yellows and greens. You can see that her body and the donkey's body and the background are equated. And I think in other of his paintings, this is one same time, Memories of Mount Athos, you see the mountain here as a cube, and you see the mountain, and you see the diagonals here, and you see just the woman's head and her fingers and her knee and her foot, all stylized and abstract. Well, I would argue from these paintings that he made an equation between the female body, the woman's body, the woman too, as a force, and nature, or really, and landscape. In other words, these women are pieces of landscape. And what's so crazy about them in a way is that the one thing about Athos is that no women are allowed on it. There's no women there. And when he writes about it, he writes about sensuality, but and this kind of incredible paradox of getting drunk on this island where there are no women, and how you yearn for women on this island. But why does he paint them on the island? Well, and 4 years later, or 3 years later. So strange obsessions. You can see how it translates into his architecture. He's quite, well, he's full of throwaway hints if you read the captions and you read enough of his work. You see, by 1930, he's no longer designing stilt buildings, and he's saying, in the Pavilion Suisse, he says that the legs of a building, the pilotis, should be like the thighs of a very strong woman. This one doesn't show the curve so much, but if you go around the back end, you can see that they relate somehow to the very fat, if you take the cross section to those legs or those shoulders, you find that the physiognomic is there, and it was intended to be there. He also compares them, by the way, to dog bones and bow ties. So there's not one metaphorical system, but there's several. And it's clear from other writings that he did see the building as a kind of metaphor for the body, and a building having a presence of the human body. So buildings are kind of portraits. And I think by 1930 that idea becomes more and more sharp in his mind. So these secret sketches, which are part of his secret and published in a book, Le Corbusier Secret, are a double secret. In other words, the secret, he talks about the secret of painting. He says, if you want to understand my architecture, it is to this hidden act that I do in secret that he says this 3 or 4 times, he writes it, that I owe its any kind of worth it has. And of course that act is a secret act because for him it can't go on in public, because if people know he's a painter, that he won't get the job as an architect. That's what he's found out, to his bitterness. People won't take him seriously as an architect if he paints. And so he does this in the morning, he does it alone, he doesn't want to talk about it. Or at least he pretends he does it alone and doesn't want to talk about it. Actually, he advertises his secret, which is why upstairs I've called it the open secret. Of course, there's more to it than that, the secret, because it's the secret of search, of meaning and parallels. And I think in these sketches from Rio, particularly this one, you see the kind of drawings he was making at the time of women of Rio, and the landscape there. There's some other drawings made. You can see that the landscape and the human body are two parts of deep metaphors for his architecture. And I think people do accept that his shift in city planning in the 30s is partly taking on this metaphor of the human body. There's another drawing of Josephine Baker on the left, and his plan Obis on the right, and his later plans for Algiers, many plans for Algiers. Well, I'll end with Ronchamp, which comes, I think, pulls so much of this together. In a way, an extraordinary building that, for me, is a standard of symbolism along with the Assembly building and can be interpreted in many different ways. Before we look at it as interpretation, let me just remind you of it. It's seen here from the south on a hill with these kind of huge dark shell forms over an open-air amphitheater, focused partly on the Virgin here, and an outdoor pulpit, and very strong forms seen in sunlight, but forms which were heavily criticized by the leaders of modernism when this building was completed in 1955. Jim Sterling, Nicholas Pevsner, and so many others attack it as irrational, as a step backward, as primitivist, as, as a retreat, as they called it, from modern architecture. I think, of course, Le Corbusier didn't see it that way at all, but he was aware of the primitive and aware of a much wider set of references than his critics were. The doorway which you enter through on certain days, which pivots, has many of his signs and symbols on it, some esoteric and some obvious. I mean, there's the cloud, or is it a French bread? There's the two hands, the interlocking of hands, and the key. The meandering river, or is it a snake? The primary forms, the red and blue series, and signs, really cosmic signs and everyday signs that you might see around you. The building opens out to the south as if inflected by the view south and bent by the sun, with a very thick, deep protective wall broken by thin holes here, and seats for only 50 to sit down, while most people have a view standing up of not only the altar and the cross, but a view out to nature. So I agree with Stan von Moos when he talks about it, when Le Corbusier talks about a nature temple in 1925. I think it's a correct interpretation to see this building as a worked out version of what he had wanted to do as a young man in La Chaux-de-Fonds. He talks in 1925 about going out on the hill with his teacher Lapatinier and the other students and building a temple in the mountains devoted to nature, looking over the hills, and you can see in all this painted glasswork, you can see the natural symbolism as well as some more esoteric symbolism. I think it's important to say that, like a postmodern building, it plays very strongly a high-low game of referencing, so that if the priests who take you around here will point out how it does relate to praying hands. It can be interpreted on a populist level. These metaphors are very tightly coded in, even if suggestive in several respects. And they pointed out to me that it is, yes it is. They said a woman holding her two children to either side and embracing them in a smile. They said it, I didn't say it, I just had it drawn. By the way, just had it drawn by a student in this school, Hillel Sharkin from Israel. So these are Sharkin's drawings, shocking drawings, and they bring out the, the more you look, when the monks compare it to nuns' cowls, you can see that, or billowing sails, you can see that these aren't just fortuitous metaphors, but the thing is multiply coded as ships and a lot of other things. Well, of course, that's one kind of reading. Can you go to the next one? Thanks. It's interesting how scholars have decoded it in completely other ways. Particularly Richard Moore has analyzed it in alchemical terms. And I think those analyses have some truth to them. I also find it personally a version of something that relates to the paintings he was making in the 1940s, 1941, when he was collaborating with Vichy, working for Marshal Pétain's government and trying very hard to establish his kind of architecture as the authority. Here was a time when, when his collaborators had left him, had a fight with him, had broken from him because they didn't like his going to Vichy. He went to Vichy and set up shop there, and really tried to meet Pétain. And he could see, of course, that these authorities, these fascists, had no time for him, but he didn't stop because he felt it was more important to get his architecture built and carry through his message of transformation. But as this drama was playing itself out, as the Second World War was, in the making, he started to paint these paintings without the human figure in them. And he writes, he says, I got completely fed up with the human, and so I started drawing crazy pictures. The Ubu series, the series of Ubu Moi, based on Alfred Jarry's Crazy King character. And he said, isn't the time one of crazy kings? Isn't the time of fascism one of idiocy? He says this retrospectively, but at the time, and here are some of his Ubu sculptures and paintings, he starts inventing this new symbolism, this new symbolic language. And what's interesting about it is how particularly this form here, this ear form, becomes one of the generators of the plan of Rorschach. I think you can see it as both ear and as the other metaphor he makes it as eye or periscope. He talks about these calottes as eyes and periscopes that look over the four horizons. Actually, his very first drawing here only shows two horizons being taken in, and later elements show the square grid. This drawing, which I've enhanced, shows the building is turned inside out. So when he says an inside is always an outside, you can read Rorschach as a caved space, as a space where space is carved out from nature. So there's no building. There's just a planting in the space around the building, and you enter directly in from the trees into the building. So it's like a cave church he was doing previously. Well, I say all this because I want to suggest that these multiple readings, the building as a grid, as an Indian rubber grid, the building as a periscope and as an ear, it suggests that there's the reading of this as a synesthetic building. In other words, the deep metaphor is that the eyes and the ears, and he even talks about the smell, being taken up in this building. So it's and I think this is part of the secret, it's a building which has a reading on the level of his painting, which opens up other secrets. So if you look as the alchemical Corbusier that Richard Moore and others have analyzed, this is a tapestry of 1957 with what Moore calls the moon goddess. You can see in her shoulder and her breast, part of her breast, you can see the prow shape and the horn of Capricorn. This is how, this is the alchemical reading that Moore gives. I think also if you compare it to work of David Saleh or Sigmar Polke, you can see that the later Corbusier paintings are these kind of layered multimedia compounds in which his earlier purist painting has been left for something where the contours and the colors are out of sync. And the layering are like the multi-layered paintings that are produced in a media age where cartoons are layered over photographs. Anyway, if you decode Ronchamp according to some of the signs in his painting, then this painting, which was over his dining table, is a kind of key, as von Moos has shown. And I've taken parts of the building, for instance, this shadow line created by the shadow of the prow shape, and seen it as similar to that shadow line there, or the building seen at night. You can see the silhouette of Ronchamp there in another painting. This is Toro 12. So there are these correspondences between arm and breast and shoulder, and prow and horn, and Capricorn's horn. And you can see breast and buttocks in the same, as a transformation. Again, out of this painting, you can read these not only as the eyes, which they're meant to be, but as breasts and as buttocks. And you can see, if you look at the floor plan of Ronchamp, you can see you enter through those forms there. It's a penetration through there. Then if you look at the bull's nostrils in Toro 12, or the infinity sign there, you can see in the shotgun of the gargoyle on the side of the building, that cantilevered element that lets out water, you can see the infinity sign, or the eyes, or the nostrils. So the argument then is that this is a multivalent symbol rather than a series of signs, and his painting, indeed, open up some of these meanings. By no means all. But to conclude, I want to bring out a different point than the one that Howard Gardner makes. While I accept that there is something to Gardner's analysis, I mean a great deal to it, that this protean creator follows a certain pattern, to a certain extent even Corbusier tracked Picasso. Gardner says there's a 10-year rule. Every 10 years the creator reinvents himself, throws off his master, divorces his wife, fires his office. In fact, Le Corbusier fired his office from time to time. You can see Le Corbusier fitting into this, and you can see that there's a psychological type which, in a marriage of opposites, which, again, an alchemical marriage of woman and man, which is evident in this drawing, which explains this protean dialectic of a multiple personality. I think that another explanation for his continuous reinvention, continuous revolution, continuous creation, is the fact that if you think of the 20th century as an evolutionary space, then what's so extraordinary about it is its turbulence, is the fact that in this diagram, at least, there are something like 450 architects. There are 20 major architects. There's 60 isms that become wasms, and there are 100 movements, trends. For instance, things like the internet and things like plastics, mobile homes, and so forth. All the things that affect architecture and that drive architecture forward, the kind of demon of change, which is it's an engine of continuous revolution. So I'd argue that as well as being something that's internal to the protean character, it seems to me that continuous revolution has been something that's driven these architects and driven, at least Le Corbusier, and driven these other creative characters. So the impetus is as much from the out as it is from the inside. That is to say, it is because Le Corbusier wanted to lead architecture that he reinvented himself every 10 years. The 10-year rule that Gardner sees underlying Freud, Einstein, Picasso, and all the rest is the result of external pressures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. I think there's still a little bit of time left for some questions. I should maybe clarify something. Occasionally, Charles doesn't mention the dates of things. And the work of that student is probably from 1978 or 80. He somehow mentions it as if it's a student now doing that drawing. And I think it's probably important to clarify that it's probably from about 22, 23 years ago. I think it would be great, since there are so many people who are familiar with this topic, maybe they could make some comments, but maybe I could start by asking for a point of clarification. It seemed to me that the end part of the lecture, where you focused on Ronchamp and try to argue for this notion of the kind of multivalence or multi-points of view as related to the question of symbolism. The method of reading that you apply to this symbolism, though, it seems from that side of the room to be more a method of actually reading the sign rather than the symbol, because somehow if you are seeing the faces, if you're seeing the shapes as things that are so present, that seems to be following a theory of sign rather than one of symbol, whereby, for example, in Ronchamp, there is probably also the idea of Ronchamp as a church and the way that it would exist in terms of how it operates, in terms of the symbolic dimension of the church, where in fact it might not be relying so much on symbolic references, but in terms of situational conditions that have to do more with the light, with the window, with the material dimension of the project. So I'm just wondering why if you could explain that in terms of the difference between sign and symbol, in terms of how you apply to Ronchamp.
Right. I agree with you entirely, Moisin, that if I were giving a full analysis of Ronchamp, I would go into the light and space more. I just passed over it as quickly as I possibly could in order to make some other points. But sure, when you show a series of slides and you make these individual points, you're denoting the signs. So you're reducing it to a whole lot of signs and then verbally saying, well, it adds up to a symbol. And that's my defense. In other words, I agree that you experience it as a whole indissoluble mixture of all of those elements. But analytically, I think that some of what I showed and some of what I talked about come together to make a symbol. In other words, it's ambiguous. You can look at any of those forms and say, well, is that the reason? No. The reason for the form always outstrips what you can say about it. And that's what a true symbol is. It always goes beyond these interpretations you put on it. That's what makes it multivalent. So I think there are other equally, maybe not so equally, but somewhat equally valid interpretations to it as a temple to nature. I don't think you can do anything with a symbol. You can't make it go anyway, but you can certainly drag more out of it than I was suggesting. But all I'm saying in my defense is that I was showing the analytical parts, and maybe they appear as signs when you show them that way.
No, I agree with you. Not to belabor the point. It just seems that if you want to make the argument about a theory of symbol, you then make explicit what is the symbolic dimension, right, and what is the sign dimension in the work. That's all. I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Are there any questions? Yeah. Maybe you can take.
And do you want Mike?
No, no,
Is there a mic?
Can I ask you two questions about Chandigarh? One is, to what extent, one of the problems of the place is that it's become an open-air museum.
Is that turned on you?
Can you speak? It's on.
It's on. One of the problems of the place is that it's become an open-air architectural museum because very little has changed and very little is allowed to be changed. To what extent was that Corbusier's own intention that he wanted it to remain the way it was designed at the time? Second question about Chandigarh. You make a very interesting point that the assembly hall is there to celebrate nature and express its feelings about nature and so on. It's also a profoundly political place, and so is the whole city. To what extent do those two things dovetail? What were his politics? Did he have a kind of sense of organic politics or organic hierarchy, or that nature and politics somehow intersect in his mind?
Well, it's, you know, his politics were very strange in the sense that, and again, some of this is up in the exhibition, he said, all my life, people have been trying to crush me. They call the capitalists called me a communist, the communists called me a capitalist, I've been called a fascist, everything in the book. And as an architect, I've been called a painter, and as a painter, I've been called an architect. So he suffered under labeling, even though he was the greatest labeler. And so when you asked me what his politics were, he said, to give you one answer, that when in 1934 the Communist Party asked him to join them, he wrote back, he said, "It is not I who should join you, but you who should join me." And that, it was in one of his more, I mean, of course he must have been laughing when he sent that answer back to them, but I'm afraid he often believed that he was the authority, that his thing was, he wrote this chapter, Architecture or Revolution, and he said revolution can be avoided by more architecture, by better architecture. So he convinced himself, he talked himself up into a lather of belief that really architecture could solve political problems, you know, that in his early, at least in the 20s, he believed that. He was a kind of technocratic utopian who thought more housing could solve the housing problem, and therefore in politics, like a Marxist in a sense, he thought that politics was would wither away as the administration of things took over. By the 30s, though, he changed completely. I mean, this is one of these transformations, and his politics became anarcho-syndicalist, and he joined one anarcho-syndicalist group after another, and their relations to fascism were very problematic, too, because for reasons that I don't have time to go into. But he and Camus and others started a group which was a proto-Mediterranean group, saying we must have a local democracy based on regional truths in which, in an anarcho-syndicalist way, things trickle down and up. But if you look at that diagram, those diagrams, you see that they have crypto-fascist, you know, elements in them, which by the 40s lead him to compromise with Pétain, to believe in the great man theory. By the 50s, of course, he's a broken person in the sense he's collaborated, his friends have left him, you know, his great woman friend has left him too. So he's lost the respect of some people around him, and he's not getting jobs. And so he changes again and becomes a kind of liberal ameliorist. And so when he gets the job of Chandigarh, with Nehru, you could say that he's in his third political phase, and he believes now in the great man, still the great man being Nehru and the great man being himself. And Nehru and himself formulate a view of kind of trickle-down liberalism in which, you know, Nehru says, design me the great city of the future, of the second machine age, and design me the temple of India. And I mean, that really appeals to Le Corbusier. And every time Le Corbusier is in trouble, which is a lot of the time, he writes a letter personally to Nero and says, help, 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 get me out of this problem and fire all my people under me that are giving me trouble, and, you know, bang the table. So there is this authoritarian figure. Sorry, it's such a long answer, but the answer is long because it's not simple. And I think he didn't like politics. He told CM, don't mess with politics. Architects will be chewed up if we do. That doesn't mean to say there wasn't a implicit politics, but this implicit politics in him changes decade by decade. And I think in the end, he just ended as disillusioned with politics and believing in a kind of cosmic solution to things. It was not resolved on political level. Chandigarh as a city, it was designed for 500,000 people. Today it has 800,000. Its prediction is for 1.2 billion, sorry, let me get, million in about 10 years, and it'll settle out maybe at 2 million. So it's going to be 4 times as big. Now, what's a catastrophe there is that the authorities, the judges particularly who run that city, and all of the power structure do not want any change. And so ironically, they've frozen the whole city plan in order to keep their own villas in the north, which are really basically English upper-class villas. And they're leading a kind of neo-colonial life. And Chandigarh can't change. It's been frozen and pickled. And Corbusier's sayings are being used by these people to keep the situation the same. So there's a very funny collusion between, as it were, quote, great architecture and enforcement of no change. While the people who come to the city, you know, as in every Indian city, most of them are unhoused, or they're unofficial. They're called unofficial people. And these people are kept on the outskirts and are not catered for. Yet at this symposium, and I have to say this, celebrating Chandigarh for 50 years, it seemed to me that 80 to 90% of the speakers were saying passionately, you know, something must be done to build the next growth, the next stage of Chandigarh. So there is certainly, I think there is consensus among all urbanists and architects outside of Chandigarh that it's a very nice primary structure laid down, but it's certainly in need of, first of all, a whole new transport system for the poor and a certain development system, none of which is about to happen, practically speaking. Corbusier would have wanted change, I think there's no question. But at the same time, there are many pronouncements which he said, when I lay this down, this must be kept as a city of, you know, I can't remember what it's one of his 3 types of city. It must remain a city of the brain, the city of politics, you know. It can't have industry in it. And that, therefore, you know, planners are using these dictatorial dicta to suppress the reality. So my answer to you, I'm sorry, is you see, full of, on the one hand and on the other hand, because that's the way he was.
He was quite a politician. Anybody else? Any other questions? Maybe on the question of Howard Gardner and the aspect of genius and creativity, which is obviously part of the speculation. It would be good if you could clarify, are you suggesting that Gardner is also saying that the notion of exemplary creators or geniuses in your terms also necessitates the idea of continual revolution, in the sense that these people always need to do many things, or is it possible to have exemplary creators who are focused on one thing and they don't necessarily have to have many different periods?
No, he's very strong on this. He says, you know, he says, I'm talking as a scientist and saying this is the type of the people, of the most creative people. He's not talking about regular creativity or everyday creativity. He doesn't use the word genius, doesn't want to use the word genius, but he says, if you think of those people, Einstein, Stravinsky, T.S. Eliot, Picasso, Martha Graham, Gandhi, and Freud, all overthrew their paradigm. Einstein turned Newton on his head, and Picasso turned the previous Impressionism on its head. Each one of these, Stravinsky did the same thing, each one had to have a revolution, had to overthrow, had to destroy. And a point of these protean characters is the destructive, creative psyche. And what Gardner says happens, and what's good about, not only is his theory, but what's really interesting about his book, is that he analyzes in depth each one of these characters through their whole life. And so it's not just a theory, it's applied, and it's very convincing because he knows each one so well. Well, I find his analysis right in all 7 cases, and it happens to work in Le Corbusier's case. In other words, Corbusier follows the same patterns, the same type of character, same kind of revolutionary personality, and even follows the 10-year rule of reinventions. He's also, one has to say, on some levels just as nasty to his wife and his women and his friends and his, his workers as all the other 7 characters. In other words, Gardner does come up with this depressing archetype of a not very nice person as the creative protean creator. Now,
you're not claiming to be an exemplary creator.
No. But no. So I went up to Gardner. I happen to know. I said, look, this works very well for those people, but it doesn't work for postmodernists like Frank Gehry, and others, and it doesn't work for people who are not throwing over their field. Gardner's point is that what happens to these characters is that, they all have a mentor, 2 mentors, and then they throw them over. Well, this is absolutely true of Le Corbusier. La Platinier and Ozonfon were 2 mentors who he fell out with and fought. Now, he says what happens is when they're creative and they do so well, after they're beginning their great first contribution, they get to believe that this creativity has to be fed, like a demon. And so they get more excited by this creative demon on their backs than they do by their personal relations. And so they start sacrificing one by one their friends and their women, everybody has to feed the creator. In other words, the creator becomes, and then they feel really badly about that. And this creates other interesting contradictions. Well, you see, there's elements of truth in Le Corbusier's life about that. So I find the parallels really interesting, the psychoanalysis pretty convincing. Of course, you can't make it an absolute type, but I do have an appendix where I say the normal genius of the 20th century, Le Corbusier fits the bill. The thing that I would like to, I would say 2 things, is that it's the outside influences Gardner's missing. I think these people have to do this in order to stay in the same place. It's the Red Queen hypothesis. You have to run very fast in order to stay in one place.
Yes, I would simply to insist a little bit on how Gardner's theory and ask you if you had elaborated a little bit on the less biographical and more, let's say, structural side of Gardner's theory about multiple intelligences. So he's suggesting there are multiple intelligences and they're not gifts or talents, but specific way of solving problems. Have you thought something about the specific way Corbusier is working throughout all these kind of evolution?
In fact, thank you, because that's the very thing I wanted to say tonight. I forgot to say. Really, it's funny. Howard Gardner is known in America for having changed American education and for having introduced, in the place of IQ, the intelligence quotient, multiple intelligences. And he's shown, he argues that there's 7. I don't know if he likes the number 7. He comes up with it a lot. But there's a musical intelligence, which is quite different from a physical intelligence, which is quite different from a verbal intelligence. Anyway, he says that these are the 7 basic intelligences. And these 7 account for, 95% of what is called IQ. And they are, no one's proficient in all 7, and we compensate and so forth. And so if we're talking about intelligences, then we've got a much better view of how the brain works and how the personality works. my feeling about Corbusier is that you can reverse the thing and say, taking this other theory of Gardner's, and say, well, now, why was Corbusier creative? He was creative because he thought through 7 different modes. He thought through books, he thought through painting, he thought through sketching, he thought through city planning, he thought through mathematics, he thought through the female body, he thought through all of these discourses. And if you take these discourses together and you look at a piece of architecture and then you rotate it in your mind in front of you. You didn't have the computer then, but if you can think of architecture on all these different levels through these different multiple intelligences, you're going to produce a deeper building. And I think in that sense we owe what the exhibition upstairs argues, that it's the multiple media, in the end, the multiple media which created the creation. In other words, if you just simply, in a sense, externalize the media from his body, from his mind, and you reflect the architecture through his writing, you can see he was led to do things because the writing pushed him there. The painting pushed him in a different direction. The sculpture pushed him in another direction. And it's having these multiple media that led to his creativity.
Well, I think tomorrow there'll be a lot of opportunity for obviously developing this conversation. I know that there'll be other points of view and focus on different areas of the work of Corbusier. And please come and join us at 10:30 in the morning. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. You didn't know who I was talking?
Yes, of course I did.
He was here.
I know, I'm saying that. He was here.